I call this hearing of the Federal Spending Oversight Subcommittee to order. Before we start, I want to express this subcommittee's deepest sympathy to the family and friends of Ed Lorenzen, who was a senior policy advisor at the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. Ed and his 4-year-old son tragically passed away 12 days ago in a house fire. Ed was a well-respected member of the budget community and possibly the foremost champion of the PAYGO rule. In fact, his Twitter handle was Captain PAYGO. By all accounts, Ed was a great guy and a dedicated budgeteer. Literally the day of his death, Ed was talking with my staff in preparation for this very hearing. So this tragedy is close to our hearts and is with deep sympathy to his family that I ask everyone to join me in a moment of silence. Thank you. We're here today to discuss continuing resolutions, omnibus appropriations, missed funding deadlines, and shutdowns. This hearing is entitled, "The Terrible, No Good, Very Bad Ways of Funding Government." I can't think of a better way to describe how dysfunctional Congress is with its power of the purse. Today, government is open and on its 4th CR of the year. Who knows what will happen Thursday, but what we know is we're already a third of the way through the fiscal year and still using temporary funding. Just makes no sense. And this isn't a partisan problem either. The last time we passed all appropriation bills on time was 1997, which was only the 4th instance all appropriations were done since 1977, 4 times in 41 years. Missing appropriation deadlines have consequences. It causes uncertainty in agencies and delays plans, which may increase costs to the taxpayer. In October, we had a hearing on wasteful end-of-the-year spending. Part of the problem there is caused by the use-it-or-lose-it mentality, but we also heard that delayed appropriations compresses the funding window, meaning even good projects become lower quality as there's just less time to plan and obligate the funds. Another part of the problem that concerns me is that once Congress goes beyond the funding deadline, our incentive turns to doing an omnibus appropriation, which is maybe only slightly less bad than a continuing resolution. That is where we glue together all the unfunded programs into one single giant bill. How can Congress do proper oversight of spending when we throw everything into one giant trillion-dollar bill, sometimes with only hours to scrutinize and no chance to amend? As a doctor, I need an ophthalmoscope to look at the back of your eye, but being able to take a closer look helps me to diagnose and fix these problems. That's what we need in the budget process. It's exactly what we need is a closer look. Instead, we're given one giant bill with little debate and asked to vote up or down, and rarely allowed to amend the bill. Of course, we all know about and dread the government shutdowns. In fact, I often say, while I don't want to shut down government, I also am not sure I want to keep it open and still borrowing $1 million a minute. They're both not very good solutions. Making government less efficient, we've got to talk about, what we can do to fix it. So I've introduced something called the Shutdown Prevention Act, which says at the end of the fiscal year, anything still not funded would automatically be funded at 99% of the previous budget. What should make this a win-win for everyone is that agencies will have at least a minimum level of certainty. Government won't completely shut down. They'll keep spending money, but there will be a penalty. They'll spend 1% less. And around here, spending 1% less ought to be enough of a penalty to get everybody to do their job and do the appropriation bills on time. So I think this is an important and timely hearing, and I thank Senator Peters for working with our office to set this up. With that, I'll recognize the ranking member for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for providing this forum on this topic today. And it's in a collaborative and bipartisan way, in a bipartisan spirit, and I always appreciate that of you, Mr. Chairman. The conversation that we are having today goes to the heart of how Congress functions as an institution. One of our most fundamental responsibilities is to pass a budget and to fund the government. This is our most basic job, and the American people, quite frankly, just expect us to get it done. The way we budget and fund the government is, unfortunately, now dysfunctional. It's a problem that has gone on for far too long, and we have become accustomed to it. It's become the new normal, and the purpose of today's hearing is to say enough is enough. This is no way to govern. This broken process filled with last-minute deadlines, continuing resolutions, and even government shutdowns is wasteful, it's inefficient, and harmful to the American people. That is why our esteemed panel of witnesses, you are all here today, and I appreciate you being here. I appreciate your expertise, your experience, and your time. Your testimony today is critical to helping us diagnose the severity of our budgeting problem and how it impacts government services and wastes taxpayer dollars. I hope you can help us explore some constructive solutions. Our broken budget process needlessly shortchanges effectiveness of federal programs through the never-ending cycle of short-term continuing resolutions and omnibus spending bills that create budget crisis and keep the budget perpetually at the edge of a shutdown. That threat occasionally comes to pass, as we just saw recently. Though Congress designed a clear budget process in the 1974 Congressional Budget Act to establish our own funding priorities and set a timeline for enacting them into law, we have failed time and time again to live up to our own standards. In fact, Congress has only managed to enact all 12 required appropriation bills on time in 4 of the past 40 years. Instead, this body has passed an average of 4 CRs every year, and the frequency has only increased in recent years. Since 2011, we've passed 34 CRs. Sometimes these CRs fund the government for as little as 1 day at a time. As a result, the majority of sitting members of Congress have never seen this body pass a budget through, quote, regular order. We can and we must do better. First, I'm hopeful that this hearing will offer a candid discussion of the facts and emphasize the true cost and consequences of governing through short-term CRs. We lurch from crisis to crisis, wasting countless hours across the federal government as employees prepare for shutdowns or draft detailed, comprehensive yearly budget documents that are completely disregarded. Most significantly, this dysfunctional pattern needlessly threatens our national and economic security. Without a long-term budget outlook, our military is unable to plan ahead and effectively conduct their critical missions to protect the American people and American interests abroad. Instead of thoroughly evaluating spending priorities or conducting meaningful oversight of government programs, Congress kicks the can down the road and lets taxpayers foot the bill. And in the event of a shutdown, hundreds of thousands of federal workers are furloughed from their jobs, and Americans of all walks of life lose access to important public services that they count on. To offer a better sense of the real impact this has on federal workforce, I ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, to enter into the record a letter that I received today from the American Federation of Government Employees.
Without objection.
Last week during a hearing in the Commerce Committee, I asked the director of the National Science Foundation about the impact of continuing resolutions and shutdowns on her agency. Not only did the NSF have to cancel a whole slate of important meetings, including with several Nobel Prize laureates, the director also told me, quote, that everybody just basically stops work in order to gear up for a shutdown. That's unacceptable. That's a lot of time and tax dollars wasted preparing for a shutdown that wouldn't happen if Congress simply did its job. I look forward to hearing a robust discussion from today's witnesses about the potential reforms and solutions that help us break this harmful cycle and restore regular order to the congressional budget and appropriations process. We must work together in a bipartisan way to reduce our reliance on short-term CRs, mitigate the harmful effects of this uncertainty on federal agencies, and minimize the cost of this broken process to taxpayers. I'm sure the chairman would join me in saying that we are very eager to hear your ideas today. So let's get to work. Thank you very much, and thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for this committee.
Thank you, Senator Peters. With that, I'll begin with our witnesses' opening statements. I'll remind the witnesses that their statements have already been submitted, and we'd like to try to keep it to 5 minutes if possible. Our first witness is Heather Kraus. She is the Director of Strategic Issues for the Government Accountability Office. Ms. Kraus previously testified before this subcommittee on wasteful end-of-the-year spending. In that testimony, she pointed out that part of what can cause spending surges at the end of the fiscal year and lead to waste in agency funding being continually delayed. So we want to bring Ms. Krause back and continue that discussion to learn more about the costs and inefficiencies created by funding delays and uncertainty. Ms. Krause has a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Minnesota Duluth and a master's degree in public policy from the University of Minnesota. Ms. Krause, thank you for coming back.
Thank you, Chairman Paul, Ranking Member Peters, and members of the subcommittee. I thank you for the opportunity to discuss our work on how continuing resolutions and other budget uncertainties affect agencies and the services that they provide. As you know, Congress annually faces difficult decisions on what to fund among competing priorities and often postpones final funding decisions to allow more time for deliberations. To prevent funding gaps, Congress enacts continuing resolutions, or CRs, so that agencies can continue to operate government services until Congress and the President reach agreement on regular appropriations. In all but 4 of the last 40 years, as was noted in the opening statement, Congress has passed CRs to provide agency funding until agreement is reached. In some years, including the current fiscal year, when new appropriations or a CR have not been enacted, there's a lapse in appropriation or government shutdown. This leads some agencies to halt their activities and furlough employees until appropriations are enacted. Our prior work on federal budgeting has shown that operating under a CR, the possibility of a government shutdown, or both, creates uncertainty and management challenges for agencies. In response to these uncertainties, agency officials have taken various actions and leveraged available authorities to execute their budgets and carry out their missions. Today, I will focus my statement on 1, the effects of CRs and shutdowns on agency operations, and 2, legislative authorities and agency actions that assist in managing these budget uncertainties. Our prior work has shown that CRs and government shutdowns can increase costs and reduce government services and productivity. For example, in 2009, we reported that agencies delayed contracts, grants, and hiring during a CR because final appropriations could have been less than anticipated. For example, officials at the Bureau of Prisons told us then that delaying one of their contracts had prevented them from obtaining lower prices and resulted in $5.4 million in additional costs. We also found that the effects of CRs can differ based on their number and duration. Shorter and more numerous CRs can lead to more repetitive work. This includes having to enter into short-term contracts or grants multiple times to reflect the duration of a CR. On the other hand, longer CRs can allow for better planning in the near term. However, they can lead agencies to rush to obligate funds late in the fiscal year. Agency officials told us that following a lengthy CR, they can end up spending funds on lower priority items that can be procured quickly if they don't have enough time to spend funds on higher priority needs. Congress and agencies have taken several actions that help manage budget uncertainties and disruptions associated with CRs and shutdowns. For example, CRs include standard provisions that require most agencies to operate similar to the prior year, but to spend conservatively and without starting new activities. Congress may also choose to include other provisions in CRs called legislative anomalies. Such provisions can address specific issues certain agencies face in executing their budgets during a CR. Further, Congress can provide some agencies with multi-year budget authority. With this authority, there's less pressure to obligate the funds at the end of the year, and agencies may be able to continue some activities during a shutdown. Agency officials can also take actions to mitigate budget challenges. For example, agencies may have the ability to shift contract and grant cycles to later in the fiscal year when they are less likely to be under a CR. Agencies also establish contingency plans and other guidance to assist in managing CRs and shutdowns. In close, the federal budget is an inherently political process in which Congress faces difficult decisions on what to fund among competing priorities. While not ideal, CRs continue to be a common feature of the annual appropriations process. There is no easy way to avoid or completely mitigate the effects of CRs and other budget uncertainties on agency operations. Agencies must act within their authorities to manage their programs in the face of funding uncertainties and constraints. We believe the experiences identified in our work provide useful insights for Congress. This concludes my statement. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Krause. Our next witness is Mr. Clint Brass, who is a specialist in government organization and management at the Congressional Research Service. Mr. Brass is here to talk about how the process is supposed to work and what happens when it doesn't, what goes on at agencies when they are on a CR or worse during shutdowns, and how the process has evolved over time. Mr. Brass has a bachelor's degree from Cornell, a Master of Public Policy from Michigan's Gerald Ford School, and an MBA from Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Paul, Ranking Members Peters, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to testify. As requested, this testimony focuses on interim continuing resolutions, also known as CRs, their purposes and effects, and related subjects, including the possibility of a government shutdown. The written statement goes into more detail, and I would like to acknowledge the work of CRS colleagues from which this statement benefits. So, some highlights. First, context. The power of the purse is a legislative power. The Constitution provides that funds may be drawn from the Treasury only through appropriations made by law. Nevertheless, the Constitution doesn't spell everything out. So the budget process has evolved with statutes, chamber rules, and the use of discretion. As practiced in recent decades, the process entails many sub-processes, and many actors are involved. If problems are perceived with aspects of the overall process, it may be fruitful to look at these aspects, but also how they relate to the whole. Notably, changes to the budget process may affect power relationships and influence policy outcomes. Proposals may be controversial, therefore. During high-stakes negotiations over annual appropriations measures, several options present themselves to Congress and the President. These include coming to agreement on regular appropriations acts by October 1st, when the fiscal year begins, or using one or more interim CRs to extend temporary funding beyond October 1st until decisions are made on full-year funding, or not agreeing on full-year appropriations or interim funding in a CR, resulting in a temporary funding gap and a corresponding shutdown. As has been noted, in practice, CRs are commonplace in the federal budget process. During the 25 fiscal years covering fiscal year 1952 to 1976, one or more CRs were enacted during all but one fiscal year. From fiscal year 1977 to present, all of the regular appropriations acts were completed before the beginning of the fiscal year in 4 years out of 42, including this one. In general, interim CRs are intended to, 1, preserve congressional funding prerogatives to make decisions on full-year funding, and 2, to prevent a government shutdown during negotiations within Congress and between Congress and the President. Consequently, interim CRs include significant restrictions on agencies. An interim CR may be structured purposefully as less than optimal in order to retain incentive for negotiators to come to an accord. If restrictions would cause major disruptions, a CR may include exceptions to the restrictions, or so-called anomalies. Anomalies tend to be rare, however. Thus, apart from preserving prerogatives and preventing a shutdown, CRs may have significant effects. First, the restrictive funding level and pace of an interim CR may affect an agency's activities. For example, agencies may reduce or delay hiring staff or awarding contracts and grants. Second, an agency may experience uncertainty about what its final funding level and composition of the funding will be. Uncertainty may cause an agency to alter its operations, rates of spending, and spending patterns. Third, because an interim CR imposes tight restrictions, it may increase an agency's administrative work burden. Fourth, a CR's prohibition on new projects may delay or disrupt an agency's ability to undertake planned activities and also to be nimble in response to events. In 2008 and 2009, CRS and GAO each explored potential and reported effects of interim CRs. GAO also identified factors that influence how agencies manage during CRs and mitigate uncertainty. While common themes emerge from analyses like these, the specific reported impacts vary across agencies and from year to year, as one might expect from agencies with varied missions and funding mechanisms. Looking ahead, CRS takes no position on the advisability of particular options. However, if options for legislation or oversight or further study are of interest, Potential strengths and weaknesses may be explored and analyzed. In the meantime, I would be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bass. Our next witness is Maya McGinnis, President of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget and the head of the Campaign to Fix the Debt. Ms. McGinnis is one of the leading voices on budget policy. She has testified numerous times before committees on the dangers of our fiscal trajectory and has worked on several commissions to reform the process and right the fiscal ship. Her work has caused the Wall Street Journal to dub her an anti-deficit warrior. That's great.
Like that?
Congratulations. I just wish we were more effective at listening. Ms. McGinnis has a bachelor's degree from Northwestern and is a graduate of the Kennedy School at Harvard. Ms. McGinnis, you are recognized.
Thank you so much. And thank you very much for your kind words about Ed Lorenzen, who was an invaluable colleague. And doing a hearing on CRs without him just doesn't feel right. So thank you for the committee to having us here today. And I'll touch on several main points. First, budgeting is one of the most basic functions of governing, and we're failing at it. Second, CRs and omnibuses represent a failure of the budget process, as do obviously shutdowns. Third, our fiscal situation is approaching dangerous territory, and we seem utterly intent on making it worse. And finally, there are multiple ways to improve the budget process, though none of them will replace the actual political will that it's going to take to fix this. So budgeting is central to governing. It's the opportunity to agree to national goals, to contemplate the policies to achieve them, to lay out the means of financing them, and our budget reflects our values, our priorities, our nation's game plan, and our shared purpose as a nation. So no business would consider operating without a thoughtfully designed budget, and certainly no country should. And yet the way we budget now represents how broken our process of governing has become. And basically our budget process is completely different what we have on paper and what we have in reality. So the process we engage in suffers from a number of shortcomings, including a lack of transparency, a lack of accountability, a focus on the short term, an abundance of gimmicks, which seem to grow with every budget session, autopilot spending for both mandatory spending and tax expenditures, and increasingly terrible fiscal outcomes. The fact that shutdowns and defaults are sort of part of the budget terms right now is just utterly alarming. The breakdown of the budget process has caused policymakers to bounce from one self-imposed crisis to the next. We've already heard a lot of the details about the cost and the specific shortcomings involved in CRs and omnibuses. So I'll just say that both of them are both qualitatively and quantitatively problematic. And I will focus a little bit on the cost of must-pass legislation, which is something that's becoming incredibly costly and we're experiencing right now. So in the most recent example, just a few weeks ago on the CR, which ended the brief shutdown, we actually tacked on $31 billion to our debt to pass that legislation. That is, if it were made permanent, that would be close to $300 billion in borrowing. That was part of that. And it now appears that we are on the verge of a new budget deal that rumors have it adding about $300 to $400 billion to the debt. And what's happening now is that these financing methods, this borrowing is being added to bills without any discussion. It's as though the issue of deficit and debt have just kind of disappeared, and because of these must-pass bills, there's always an opportunity to tack more things on. And unfortunately, and because I'm really pleased that you're doing this hearing in a bipartisan way, it seems that most often things that are bipartisan only get there because both parties get to borrow for the things they want instead of working on bigger budget deals. This all is happening also while our fiscal picture is already quite alarming. So things were very bad a year ago when the debt was at a near record level, the highest it's been relative to the economy since World War II. Since then, as the result of an incredibly costly tax bill, our debt trajectory is much, much worse than it was before, and now we appear intent on making it even worse with stunningly little resistance as we put more into these CRs and other spending maneuvers. So we're in the midst of what I see as kind of a fiscal free-for-all, and we are soon going to see trillion-dollar deficits that have returned during a time of economic expansion. Last time we saw that, we were in the midst of a huge downturn, but now we're going to have $1 trillion that are completely self-imposed at the time where we should not be borrowing. We should be getting control of our debt so that we have enough fiscal space to deal with the future crises and downturns. So there are multiple ways that we can think about improving the process, and there are certainly few defenders of the current process that we have right now. But again, I do want to emphasize that budget process reform will in no way be able to replace the political will to confront the issues that we're trying to fix. I would group the kinds of fixes into three categories, basically incremental reforms, increasing punishments or stronger enforcement mechanisms, and finally a major overhaul to the budget process. I put myself in the camp of preferring a major overhaul because I think that's how big a change we need to meet the challenges of today. That said, I quite honestly don't think that sort of Congress is ready for the kind of big choices that would be necessary in that. So I'm very encouraged by the ideas of some of the incremental steps that would show we can make improvements work together. And it's really important that they be done in a bipartisan way because budget reform or budget process is about creating rules that people think are fair and therefore they will stick to them. So in the incremental reforms camp, I would certainly put the automatic continuing resolutions, which is something that Senator, you have put forth, and there are a couple ideas about that, and I think that would go a long way to helping address the issues that we're confronting in the budgeting process right now. I would also add to that other ideas like biennial budgeting, joint budget resolutions, which would all address some of the problems that are going on. In terms of stronger incentives or larger punishments, there are a lot of ideas that have been put out there: no budget, no pay, canceling congressional recesses, prohibiting consideration of bills that have fiscal impacts until a budget has been passed, and compelling the Senate to be in session if the chamber if the government has shut down. And then finally, there's the approach of a major overhaul. And rules we find when we study budget process, we find that rules don't actually succeed as well in forcing action as they do in enforcing action that's already been put in place. So the Peterson-Pugh Commission and the Better Budget Process Initiative, which Ed Lorenzen ran for us, has come up with a lot of different recommendations, but basically they center around a major overhaul that would focus on picking a fiscal goal, putting in place a multi-year budget that would achieve those fiscal goals, and much stronger enforcement techniques to keep that budget on track. This would also include budgeting for entitlements and tax expenditures. And I think all of these changes would make coming to agreements in the front end much more difficult, but it would greatly improve the fiscal outcomes. So I know that our country can do better than we're doing currently in terms of budgeting. I think that's one thing we can all agree on. And I'm very encouraged about focusing on budget process as a place to begin this process. So thanks so much for having us today.
Thank you, Ms. McGinnis. Our final witness is well known in budget circles and beyond. Dr. Alice Rivlin is a senior fellow at Brookings Institute and a visiting professor public policy at George Washington. She has a storied background in federal budgeting going back to the inception of the Congressional Budget Act. She served as the first CBO director from 1975 to 1983, as OMB director during the Clinton administration, and has been a big part of various groups whose aim is to reform and improve the budget process. Dr. Rivlin holds a PhD from Harvard, a bachelor's degree from Bryn Mawr, and both in economics. Dr. Rivlin, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Chairman Paul and Ranking Member Peters and members of the committee. I'm grateful to this subcommittee for holding this hearing to call attention to the total breakdown of federal budgetary policymaking. I believe this breakdown is a serious threat to our democracy and to Americans' future prosperity. I'd like to emphasize 3 points. First, the major cost of failure to agree on a budget for the current fiscal year is not the short-term cost of uncertainty and inability to plan for efficient spending, although these costs are real, as the GAO and others have pointed out. Rather, preoccupation with short-term budget warfare makes it impossible for the Congress to face up to the long-run challenges ahead and adopt policies to deal with them. These challenges are daunting. We have an aging population combined with high health costs. We have slow productivity growth and lagging wages. We are facing climate change and rising frequency of natural disasters. We've had huge increases in inequality of wealth and income and rapidly growing national debt combined with rising interest rates. As Maya and others have emphasized, these are very serious problems, especially the debt. These are tough problems to manage individually and collectively. They require consensus building and bipartisan deliberation. No one party has all the answers. but blaming and bickering over short-run CRs or converting them to omnibus bills has eclipsed serious efforts to craft long-run budget policy and economic policy. Second, the biggest obstacle to constructive economic policy making, I think, is extreme partisanship and rejection of the once honored art of consensus building and bipartisan negotiation. The framers of our Constitution bequeathed us a policy-making system that requires compromise and consensus at every stage of legislating. If we forget that and pretend we have a winner-take-all parliamentary system in which the majority party calls all the shots, we will be doomed to gridlock and wild swings in policy. Major tax and spending legislation, including health care, that affects millions of people's lives must have bipartisan buy-in to avoid the other party demonizing the policy and trying to reverse it after the next election. Moreover, differences among us are not as stark as they appear. Crafting tax and spending policy that can command broad public support involves pragmatic balancing of competing interests and values, negotiating modest changes along a continuum, and not scaring a public that is generally afraid of radical change. Bipartisan negotiation and consensus building must become, again, a normal part of congressional decision-making, not a desperate response to artificial deadlines. If the American democratic process is to regain the confidence of voters and the respect of countries that look to us for leadership. And finally, although budget process changes are, as all of us have emphasized, not a substitute for bipartisan will to solve problems together, they could help to make the task easier. The late Senator Pete Domenici and I, under the auspices of the Bipartisan Policy Center, made a proposal in July of 2015 that I believe encapsulates the main elements of a more workable budgetary process. Proposal had three main themes. One, the budget process should include all federal spending and revenues. It should not leave out the huge spending on entitlements and other mandatory programs or spending through the tax code that together now dominate the federal budget. Second, the budget should be transparent and the process should contain strong incentives for on-time completion, including, I think, an automatic CR with some penalties, as you proposed, Mr. Chairman. The budget should also have buy-in from the President and leadership of both houses. I also believe that Congress would benefit greatly from simplifying the committee and subcommittee structure to reduce overlapping jurisdictions, simplifying the budget itself by drastically reducing the number of budget accounts would also facilitate more timely decision-making. But no process or structural change will help Congress and the executive branch make decisions on the budget or resolve other major issues facing the country unless elected officials recognize that the public desperately wants you to get out of partisan attack mode and start working together to find solutions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee.
Thank you, Dr. Rivlin. At this point, we'll open it up for questions, and I know Senator Peters has a conflict, and so we're going to let him go first. He may have to leave us for another committee.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity to ask the first question. Again, thank you for this hearing. Also want to recognize Senator Jones, who I think is joining us for the first time in the committee, so welcome to the subcommittee. I'm sure you will enjoy it, and it's good to have you here. Well, it certainly appreciated the testimony of all four of you, and clearly highlights the pickle that we find ourselves in and the fact that we've got to fix this system. One way in which Congress has dealt with this issue, in addition to CRs, are the omnibus spending bills, which, as you know, just lump everything all together in 1 year, and all of us who aren't part of any of that process basically get one vote to fund this incredibly large enterprise called the federal government of America. And we're looking for some ways to perhaps get more involvement, where members have an opportunity to deal with some of the issues that you brought up. So I'm going to bring up a proposal that my colleague Senator Langford has actually raised. He's not with us here today. He had another commitment, but I wanted to bring up his idea, which would give members the opportunity to consider some alternative approaches, be involved in the appropriations process. And his proposal would have us work on each appropriation bill as we normally would through the committee, have that regular order process, and then strike a deal to have not one omnibus, but perhaps several omnibus that would put some of these budgets together. So 3 or 4 separate minibus appropriation bills. And rather than push through a formal change in the rules, we'd consider each bill with a set time agreement and a number of amendments. So members could actively engage in this process and offer amendments through these smaller, presumably more manageable minibuses. It seems to be as an alternative idea, but I wanted to hear from Dr. Rivlin, Ms. McGinnis, maybe if you would mind commenting on would you see that as a positive step forward, or do we need to do something different?
I would see it as a positive step forward in the sense that 3 or 4 minibuses seems better than one omnibus.
Right.
It still is going to be a large bill, and the amendment process seems crucial. Also, the hearing process, which is in the appropriations committees, which seems to have fallen a bit into disuse. But that seems to me an improvement, but you could go further.
Right. Ms. McInnes?
Yes, so I would share that. I think that is an improvement for sure. I don't think it would be the bigger kinds of overhauls that I'm kind of drawn to. And when I think about budgeting, I think you want to make sure every step of budgeting you're going through the basic process of what is the objective, what are the different options for achieving it, and what are the pros and cons of those, how are you going to finance it, and how are things working, the evaluation process. So I think a lot of those big picture things are lost in the appropriations process, but I certainly think this is an improvement because I think bills where you have more of a chance to understand the details and more people are involved and being engaged in that is clearly important, because appropriations is just kind of this foreign area to so many people where they don't understand what's going on in there, and so drawing more people into the process at a greater level of detail is definitely a plus.
Great, thank you. The other issue that I have with CRs, and one shared by folks in the military in particular, I serve on the Armed Services Committee and actually have Secretary Mattis testifying before us today on our national security strategy, is the fact that it's very difficult for the military to make any kind of long-term plans in a CR process. So, Ms. Krause, I would like you to elaborate a little further on how you see continuing resolutions impacting the military and its readiness. That would be helpful for us to understand why this is such a bad idea in having CRs.
Sure. We haven't done work looking specifically or on the military issues in terms of CRs, but certainly in looking at other agencies that deal with contracting, which DoD obviously does, there can be delays in terms of their, they'll delay contracts until they know the amount of money they may have at the end of the year, or they'll kind of put that off. They delay hiring in terms of agencies dealing with CRs. And compressing those processes can sometimes reduce the quality of the competition of contracts. So there are a number of sort of inefficiencies that come from managing within CRs.
Anybody want to add anything related to Department of Defense? Mr. Brass?
Just that my colleague at CRS, Lynn Williams, has a couple reports on the subject that I'm sure she'd be happy to talk with you and your staff about.
Great. We will like that. Ms. McInnes, I'm interested in your thoughts about the deficit. Something you're the deficit attorney. Was that what I heard?
The anti-deficit war.
Anti-deficit warriors.
It wasn't my Halloween costume, though.
You said that's not your Halloween costume? He did.
Someone else dressed up as the dead.
Ah, okay.
But
well,
anti-deficit warrior.
I would be curious as to your thoughts on kind of the long-term effect. You mentioned that some of that in your testimony, so Dr. Evelyn, you did as well, as to how do we deal with these long-term, fundamental, structural problems that we have with our deficit when we're in the process of just doing these CRs. It complicates things immensely. Would you just further elaborate on it?
Yeah, it complicates things immensely. And as Alice said, it takes all of the oxygen away from solving the real problems that we need to on the fiscal front. So the first thing is that budget deficits, balancing the budget, they're not an end in and of themselves. They are part of a comprehensive economic strategy, which is critical for the country right now, particularly right now, because we have this aging of the population. Growth is going to be slower than it's been before. We need to do everything that we can to help promote growth that's shared broadly, and a key piece of that is a sustainable fiscal policy. We all know, anybody who reads CBO reports that looks at these numbers know that the big drivers right now are the aging of our population, healthcare costs, interest payments that are growing faster than the economy writ large, and revenues that are not sufficient to pay for the level of spending that we've decided to spend. And if we don't spend our time focusing on that, what it does is it leaves us in a situation where it harms us economically, excessively high levels of debt, slow economic growth. It means that interest payments are pushing out, whether you care about tax cuts or spending increases. If you're spending more on interest payments, it's not going to those things. It leaves us completely vulnerable to the next economic downturn or national disasters when they come along, because we're not able to borrow for the things that we should. And at some point, there's a potential that there would be a fiscal crisis. I don't think, because this country is the safe haven, that's likely to happen soon, but it could. And why are we trying to test the boundaries of when it would? So you want to have a sound fiscal policy, which means your debt's not growing faster than the economy. We don't have that, and we know there's no way to fix that without dealing with the drivers, meaning entitlement reform and tax reform that's ultimately going to generate more revenue. We just made that more difficult. We have to really go at the big drivers of the debt and get the debt. It's twice relative to the economy what it's been historically. We have to get it so it's not growing faster than the economy.
Well, I want to pick on what you said, because I think it's important as we're looking at dealing with the deficit to understand that this is probably a three-legged stool. One, you have to grow the economy, but also you have to deal with revenue and cost. We're focusing on the spending side of it right now, but revenue is a piece as well. And given all of the challenges that you just outlined, which I agree, and as we continue to be on an unsustainable fiscal course, this Congress just passed a tax cut that's going to add $1.5 trillion to the deficit. How should that have been done differently, perhaps, so that we don't just keep digging a deeper and deeper hole, which we just did a few weeks ago?
So we desperately needed tax reform. There was no question that our tax code was anti-competitive, anti-growth, and we were taxing the wrong things. Revenue-neutral tax reform, or tax reform that ultimately raised more revenue, would have been better for us fiscally. There were arguments out there that the tax cuts will pay for themselves. They will not, just as spending programs will not pay for themselves. Tax reform that is not debt-financed actually grows the economy more than tax reform that is. So it seemed very unwise to me to add to the debt through tax reform, just as it would through spending increases. And we're going to either need to figure out how to do a lot of the base broadening that we should have done as part of tax reform. We have, before this bill, we had $1.6 trillion in tax breaks in the tax code a year. The whole point of tax reform is to get rid of as many of them as possible and bring rates down. We didn't get rid of basically any of them. So we need to broaden that tax base to generate more revenue. And I think ultimately we're going to have to consider other revenue increases. But I also don't want to take the eyes off the picture of entitlement reform, which has disappeared completely from the conversation. And there is no way to get that fiscal situation under control without looking at both those sides of the budget of mandatory spending and revenues.
All right. Thank you.
In an attempt to reward attendance at subcommittee meetings, I'm going to go to our newest senator, Senator Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, panelists, for being here. I got to tell you, as the new kid on the block here, I don't know where to begin, because I came into this with the same concerns, almost with my hair on fire, with the same concerns that you've expressed. Ms. McGinnis, during my campaign, I had the same concerns about the tax bill. I talked more about the fact that we were increasing the deficit by $1.5 trillion. Of course, when I questioned the Treasury Secretary about that the other day, he said, no, we disagree with that. I think he's the only one. But I'd like to go back to something you said about the political will, because when having just come off the campaign trail, I didn't see out there among the public the same kind of concerns about the deficit that I have, having grown up with a Senator Howell Heflin, who was a balanced budget fiend. I just didn't see that. And as I get here to the Congress, I'm not seeing a whole lot of people who are willing to step out there to be a candidate for the Profiles in Courage Award with regard to deficits. So one of the questions I've got is, how do we get this message across? What do we do? Because in order to develop the political will in this climate, so much has to bubble up from people who are actually going to vote. And they've got to express some concerns. And people that are getting these tax cuts, even though it may be very modest tax cuts, they're still important to those folks. And so how do we do that? And I'd like to hear all of you to talk about how we can engender the public to understand and know what we're going through and what this future holds.
I think that's a very good question, Senator, and welcome to Washington.
Thank you.
I think that we have to do several things at once. There is no substitute for leadership, both in the Congress and in the White House. I'm a veteran of the period in which President Bill Clinton and Speaker Newt Gingrich worked together is perhaps not the right word. It wasn't all that friendly, but it was a negotiation toward the same goal. And both of them were articulating the goal of getting to a balanced budget. And in fact, as a result of that negotiation, we got beyond a balanced budget. We had a surplus at the end of the last century, which was the result of bipartisan cooperation to do some things that neither side really wanted to do, but which got us to a balanced budget. I think we've got to get the leadership of both parties cooperating, and they won't want to get there in the same way. We know that. But if we're going to get to a lower growth in our debt, which is a rather modest objective compared to balancing the budget, we've got to get there with both parties being willing to give something and to say, okay, we don't get everything we want, but we'll get part of it, and it will result in slower growth of debt.
Ms. McGinnis?
Yeah, also, welcome to Washington.
Thank you.
It is a really important question, and we've spent so much time kind of grappling with this. And the bottom line is, this will not be a grassroots issue that starts at the grassroots. There will not be million people marches about the debt, as much as I wish there were. But it is an issue that the grassroots understand when people go and talk to them. So things will change either from the bottom up or top down. This is going to have to start with political leadership. It's going to have to start, the president's going to have to be a part of it, and it's going to have to be bipartisan political leadership for people to believe it. But then people find that if they go talk to voters, they do understand the issue. You have to talk to them not just about this is a problem and why, and because it's so short-sighted and it harms our economic sustainability, but you also have to let them know that the solutions aren't easy. Because the problem is, nobody wants higher revenue or lower spending. In fact, Republicans don't even really want to cut spending, and Democrats don't even want to really raise taxes. That's the dirty little secret, that nobody wants to do the hard choices on either side. I think where you start is you talk about a shared fiscal goal. It used to be reaching balance. The sad situation is that our fiscal situation is so bad, we probably can't reach balance as quickly as we would like to, but we certainly should get the debt back down to sustainable levels. Then there are ways to take people through the exercise of looking at how you get there. We and other groups have budget simulators. We will go to do town halls with members of Congress and take them through the budget exercise of the different ways to fix the debt. And that's very educational for voters. We do that a lot. They learn a lot. They start to understand the real parameters. Ultimately, I think they tend to come to the conclusion you can't do this without compromising and doing things you wouldn't want to, but that the final goal of achieving something like that is worth it. And so I think it's a big issue of education from the top down. And the Coalition of Strange Bedfellows, doing it with other members who you don't agree on everything with, but you share this goal, helps people believe that it's important.
All right. Mr. Bryce, Ms. Krause, you want to add in? My time's about running out, but that's fine. If you'd like to add something, please do.
I'll just add that one suite of options that Congress might consider in this context is how to engage with the public in sharing information about the trade-offs that may be implicit in choices. And so a colleague of mine, former colleague Wendy Ginsburg, and I did a paper where we looked at the past century of how Congress has embedded public participation and additional transparency into multiple aspects of how the federal government operates. And there might be creative ways to engage the public and engage the public in those conversations.
Ms. Crown.
And just very briefly, I mean, GAO, we now do an annual report on the fiscal health of the federal government, and that has been a good communication tool in terms of helping explain the issues.
All right, great. I think my time's up, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Well, I think we all can agree. The panel seems to agree, both sides of the aisle seem to agree that continuing resolutions and shutdowns really, and even omnibuses, aren't the ideal way to do this, and that they do lead to problems. The problem becomes, now that we all agree, how come we can't figure out a solution if we all agree? And so we all agree there's a problem. We tend to all say, well, we ought to pass the 12 appropriations bills, and everybody will say, this is the last one I'm voting for. This is the last CR I'm voting for. We're going to fix it, and yet it doesn't get fixed. So there has to be something has to change. And I agree with you that we can have these process changes, which I'm for, and I've proposed some of them, but really it is also political will. People have to have the will to actually do the right thing. Because in the past, we've tried process changes. We have a pay-go rule, which is a great idea. I think it was passed actually with a Democrat majority in 2010 the last time, and yet I think we've evaded it 30 times, at least, at last count. And so we set up rules, and then we disobey our own rules. The sequester turned out to be the best thing to slow down the rate of growth of government in a long, long time, and it actually worked. We actually did reduce overall spending for a year or two, and we were heading the right direction. And yet the compromise we have in Washington is both parties want to exceed the sequester caps now. Republicans loudly want more military spending. The Democrats say, well, we'll give you that as long as you give us ours. Everybody gets, a little bit. So we have the reverse of the compromise that's needed. We continue to increase all spending. And then others will say, well, that's the, discretionary spending. It's really the mandatory spending, which is growing at about 6%. So I think if you want to see how bad the picture is, you can eliminate all the discretionary spending and you don't balance your budget. So you really do have to look at the growth of mandatory spending, but it becomes more difficult when we look at things that people have expectations for. But you can't grow at 6%. There's no way, that and the demographics, there's just no way you can continue that. So we look at some of the ways to do it, and I think there has to be some sort of punishment. Now, we could have continuing resolutions instead of shutdowns, but if we just did that, have we really fixed or helped the problem? It may be better than having a shutdown, but then we'd be just stuck with continuing resolutions that would roll on and on. We would have eliminated one problem, the shutdown. So really, what I've proposed, and I would like to hear sort of each of you comment on, is we've proposed a punishment, a hammer, and the hammer is basically spending goes down by 1%. And we know both sides don't want spending to go down. They're all for more spending, so maybe they would say, oh my goodness, all the special interests who want this money will be knocking on our door and yelling and screaming, so then they'd do it on time. I frankly think it's not too much to expect to do 12 appropriation bills. I mean, you could have a couple of months, 2 or 3 months of committee hearings, and then 9 months, take a couple of weeks, take 3 weeks for each bill. 3 weeks would be an enormous amount. We rarely spend more than a week on a bill, and we rarely have amendments. Do 3 weeks for each of the 12 appropriation bills and 3 months worth of hearings, and this is our main job, spending the money. But anyway, I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on my proposal, the Government Shutdown Prevention Act, which would, at the end of the fiscal year, after 12 months, if there's not an appropriation bill done, then you get a 1% across-the-board cut every 90 days until Congress does its job. Why don't we just start with Dr. Rivlin and we'll work our way down.
I'm for it, Mr. Chairman. I think that would help. Let me suggest one other thing, which sounded gimmicky to me when I first heard about it, but it would be no recess until you pass a budget resolution, and that gives you a framework for the appropriations bills, and I think that might work.
Yeah, I like the no recess idea, and I think actually might work. You'd be surprised how often people want to either go home or go somewhere else besides Washington, and that might help. Ms. McGinnis?
Yes, I also support it. I think the idea, when you're thinking about triggers or defaults, you have two models, either ones that are so awful that you'll never let them hit. That's what the sequester was supposed to be, and it turns out we let it hit. And like you said, it actually ended up controlling spending, though I would say on the part of the less problematic part of the budget. Or you have defaults of policies that you would want, and you let them go in place automatically if Congress isn't going to do its job. So I think the auto CR is an important idea. I think your idea of including things that would incentivize people to come to the table is also very important. I will share with you that when we did the Peterson-Pugh Commission a number of years ago, our Republican members actually said we shouldn't have the triggers be just spending cuts because enough of our colleagues will actually like them. We should also have some revenue increases. So there's different models that you could think, which is, would both sides dislike it enough? I think it's important to have something that would bring everyone to the table and realize what they need to do is their job.
I think you made a good point in the beginning is talking about extending the sequester. Instead, that, people complained it was just in the discretionary. You're right. If we had the sequester across the whole thing, one, it takes pressure off of military spending, takes pressure off the other domestic spending, and it spreads it across. And then you'd really fix government, actually, if you had an automatic sequester. And then the other thing is that with the sequester, I've also advocated that people complain that it's every department is across the board, that let the departments move their money around a little bit to deal with the sequester, and I think that could have overcome some of the objections. But yeah, sequester across the board would have actually fixed government, but they don't want sequester at all. Nobody, there's like a handful of people that are for any restraints or budget caps at all anymore, and you're going to find out this week they're going to blow through all of the budgetary caps. Mr. Brass.
So I haven't studied your legislation in depth, but I do have colleagues who focus on the topic of automatic continuing resolutions. And as you know, CRS doesn't take positions on pending legislation. And so as a consequence, we oftentimes go through perceived strengths and weaknesses of different approaches from a variety of points of view. It could be an action-forcing mechanism. It could be a way to avoid disruptions in government operations. But on the other hand, it could create winners and losers in policy terms. And so when looking at those various considerations, it becomes a complicated topic to look at, certainly.
Ms. Krause.
Similarly, ultimately it's up to Congress to decide whether to alter appropriations process. I think just through our work, some of the considerations that come up is not only do shutdowns, as we have found, kind of start and stop the work and create inefficiencies, even if there isn't a shutdown and there's a possibility of a shutdown, that there's a lot of planning and time that can go into that. So having something like this could address some of those issues. However, some of the details can be very important. I think this is some of the other panel members have mentioned. Just the incentive to bring people to the table and be willing to still negotiate and come to a final agreement. But then also, Congress sometimes uses anomalies within the CR to address specific issues for agencies. So that's something that, may need to be considered. Also, our work on sequesters is kind of gives a little more insight to this issue as well. On the one hand, across the board gives sort of fiscal discipline when we found with a sequester, but on the other hand, it can sort of equally cut good and bad programs, and so you're not sort of shifting around to what's more effective. Right. Just some considerations.
Yeah, and I personally think if you had leadership that at the beginning of the year had all 100 senators sit down in the chamber and said, look, we're going to do all the appropriation bills. We're going to spend 3 weeks on each appropriation bills, and there will be as many amendments as you want. And as a consequence, the only thing I'm asking you to do so we can get to that is to not filibuster going to these bills. And even myself, who really probably wouldn't like the spending level and might vote no on the spending level, I could agree not to filibuster, to simply get to the bill. But I think if you no one's ever asked that. No one's ever come forward and said, we're going to do this and we're going to get through them. Although the House did, I think, all 12 appropriation bills last year. So it can be done, and it really is the main thing we should be doing. It's spending the money and deciding how the money is going to be spent. So we talked a little bit about sort of punishment to try to get it done, decreasing spending or increasing taxes. The other idea that was mentioned earlier was biennial budgeting. How much of the problem would be fixed by spreading it out so we had a little bit more time, I guess, basically? Why don't we start with Dr. Rivlin again and go down?
I think a biennial budget would be a good idea. I wouldn't spread it. The danger would be that you'd take the whole 2 years to make a budget. The concept of the proposal that I've been part of is you do get the budget done for 2 years in the first 9 months of the year. So you start on the fiscal year on October 1st. I don't think it's a panacea, but I think it would free up some time to do other things. It would allow agencies to plan better if they could get an appropriation for 2 years. Now, admittedly, things happen. You have fires and wars and whatever, and you'd have to do a supplemental in the second year. But you wouldn't be reviewing the whole budget. So I think it's a good thing.
Yeah, and I think from the Constitution, I think defense would have to be done every year, but the rest of them could be biannual. I think you have to appropriate defense every year, according to the Constitution, I think.
That could be, but the Defense Department actually was a leader in doing a 2-year appropriation in, I forget when. The Congress didn't like it. They liked to do it annually.
Even if only one department had to be done every year, it'd still be, I think, a good idea. Ms. McGinnis?
We support it. We don't think it would make major differences. We do support it for a couple of reasons. One, I think the additional focus on oversight and evaluation is a lot of where the emphasis should be. Two, there's a lot of support for it. And if we could get something done and some changes, we think success would be get more success, so it would be good in that way. I'm a procrastinator. I very much worry that Congress is a procrastinator.
We have a history of that.
Yeah. There's nothing that gets done until your back is against the wall these days, so I definitely worry it's not the moment where this would be a big overhaul that would work. But I think passing something and changing the budget process right now is really in order. And so I'd like to see it part of a package.
Right. And not pro or con on the legislation, but pros and cons of a single versus a biennial budget.
Thank you,
If you have a
Mr. Chairman.
comment, feel free.
Yes, so we have that constraint in how we look at things and discuss things. Certainly, my other panelists mentioned some of the potential pros that come along with the biennial budgeting process. It could create extra time for oversight in a second year. It could also shift power relationships, in particular between the legislative branch and the executive branch. Part of the one aspect of the annual budget process that we have is that when appropriations committees put concerns or warnings or exhortations in report language to agencies, agencies know that the following year, they're going to be, that folks in Congress are going to be looking at whether agencies complied or listened closely. And if budgeting is done every 2 years, it might decrease by 50%. The opportunities then for Congress to come in and say, well, wait a minute, you guys didn't do what you said you were going to do. And so there might be some changes in behavioral incentives with agencies.
Ms. Krause, do you have a comment?
Sure. The only other consideration, as we've already talked about, the opportunity for increased oversight is just there's also it increases the planning timeline for agencies. So it goes, it increases up to 30 months when you're trying to look out that far. So sometime with forecasting, that can be very challenging.
I think one of the ironies of the way we spend money is you'll find, Senator Jones, that a lot of your day is occupied by people who come up here advocating for something they want money for. But the interesting thing is I've never, ever voted for any specific project or even for a group of projects because I've never voted for anything other than everything all at once or not. So if somebody comes up here and they want more money for legal aid or they want more money for this, I never have a vote on that. I don't even have a vote remotely close to that. So we have all these people advocating for stuff that we're not even paying any attention to. So on the one side, we're not paying attention to what we fund or how much. We're not paying attention to whether it works or doesn't work. And then we are never ferreting out misappropriated funds or funds that are going towards wasteful things. So it to me is sort of a sad state of affairs, and that's why I think the accumulation of waste, we don't ever ferret any of it out. So it just keeps accumulating year after year after year because we just keep voting on continuing spending. But I think if you think about it this way, if we were to vote, let's say we only passed 5 appropriation bills, it's 5/12 of government that wouldn't close down, when we have a shutdown sort of debate. And so, if you passed 11 out of 12, one, it gets rid of the leverage of shutting the government down too. So I really don't have much leverage, and I think it would get us away from using the leverage of shutting down the government if we had already passed, several of the appropriation bills. So I think we have to do something. But I think ultimately it is political will. It means electing people who care. And frankly, neither side cares, and that's a problem. And whether or not the public cares, I think they actually do. I think if you were to do a large survey of the American people and ask them, should the government operate the way your family budget does? Should you spend what comes in? I think largely they would be. When you ask the public whether they're for a balanced budget amendment, it's 75, 80%. But there's a lot of issues like that where 80% of the public's for something and then 80% of Washington is on the opposite side of things. So there's a disconnect, in how we represent our people. But I do appreciate you all coming. Senator Jones, did you have any other questions you'd like to ask?
Just one very brief. One, Mr. Chairman, I'm intrigued by the 1% penalty, so to speak. I think that's a great idea. I will say, Dr. Rivlin, from somebody from Alabama to shut down, now have any recess during college football season is a little harsh for me. Okay, just wanted to get that on the record. Real briefly, Ms. McGinnis, you mentioned entitlement reform. Could you give me just a brief idea of the type? I mean, my state gets a lot of dollars from those what's referred to as entitlement. Could you give me a brief idea, not take a whole lot of time, but some of the ideas that you had on entitlement reform?
Sure. So first off, the term I have learned that a lot of people don't like entitlement reform. Entitlement, the term I mean is mandatory spending, which is the part of the budget that is on automatic pilot and does not go through the appropriations process. And so if you qualify for something, you get it. I think it's, we know that the growth of mandatory programs is what's driving the increase in spending. Like I said before, the biggest pieces of it are from the aging of the population and health care. It seems to me that if we start with the biggest programs, which are Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and figure out how to make them solvent, that will go a long way to strengthening those programs and alleviating a lot of the pressure that's on the budget. Just as an example, Social Security, when it started, the retirement age was 65 and life expectancy was 62. Today, the age is gradually going up to 67, and we're living much, much longer. And we are not able to have reasonable discussions about reforming these programs. It's very political. If you start talking about it, you will see that you get a lot of pushback. But there's no avoiding these issues. My personal belief is that we have to look at all parts. Take something like Social Security. You have to look at the retirement age. You have to look at slowing the growth of benefits for people who don't depend on the program so that we can protect it for people who do. You have to look at the payroll tax cap. You have to look at there's about 5 or 6 levers that you move. But the sooner that we do it, the easier it is, because right now baby boomers are moving into retirement every single day, and that means it's becoming much more costly. These delays are costly. Figuring out healthcare costs is much more difficult. Alice is one of the leading experts in the country in how you control healthcare costs. That's part of Medicare and Medicaid. But what we do is we demagogue these issues, and we pretend we don't have to fix them. And by not fixing them, they are making the people who depend on them increasingly vulnerable. And like burying our head in the sand is just not the right approach.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm looking forward to working with you on this.
And I think you hit the nail on the head. We demagogue these issues. One party's going to push grandma off the cliff. One party doesn't care about old people. And really, these are actuarial problems. We're living longer. And you're right. When Social Security was started, there was no need for pensions hardly because most people weren't surviving beyond the retirement age. But you can fix them. You can gradually raise the retirement age. You can means test. If we do nothing, though, when the cliff comes and when we run out of money, then it's everybody. Can you imagine somebody who lives on $600 a month who gets a 25% cut in their Social Security? That's not going to be tenable. But if we were to look at it now, the wealthier among us, including most members of Congress, could agree to take some less in Social Security and be done gradually, and it really wouldn't even be the whole check. When we looked at this a couple years ago, We looked at gradually raising the age to 70 over, I think, a 20-year period, a couple months every year, and then means testing the benefits. And really, the means testing wasn't even that draconian. A lot of people had to go through it, but really those who made, I think the top is $2,200 a month for Social Security, we took them to $1,900. And those are for people who made over $100,000 a year, but it had to come pretty far down. You had to means test all the way down to people who had a salary maybe of $50,000, $60,000 a year, but you could do that through means testing, a little bit less Social Security, and raising the age, you could fix them. Healthcare is harder. When we looked at healthcare, raising the age and means testing it fixed about a third of the problem. And so healthcare is this enormous problem. So, from my mind, what you have to have is you really have to have competition. And a lot of people don't realize that healthcare in our country, over 50% of it is non-market based. Really, probably more than that, because even most private insurance, in a way, is not market based in the sense that the price is not mobile and you don't have different people offering a different price. That's what capitalism is. You have to have a mobile price and different people offering a different price. But I do cataract surgery. Every surgeon in the country gets paid the same by Medicare, so there's no price competition in cataract surgery. Even in private practice with private insurance, Blue Cross pays all the doctors in my community the same, Aetna pays them the same, United pays them the same, so nobody chooses their doctor based on price. And because that happens, there really is no competition and no capitalism really in healthcare. So you'd have to reinstitute that. But you have two sides up here in the debate. We have one side that really just thinks maybe government should be more involved. But if you do, then you have fixed prices, fixed distribution, and you'll have to ration it and tell people they can't get certain things done. And they do that in other countries. But what we had before wasn't capitalism either and didn't work either. So the old system of healthcare didn't work. The new system doesn't work. And we still have this question of which direction to go. But Medicare is not easy to fix. Thank you all for your testimony. Thank you for coming to this hearing, and thank you for your participation.
Thank you.
Biggest time thief, getting sick. At Kaiser Permanente, we've developed so many ways to help get the care you need, including after-hours urgent care, 24-hour medical advice, schedule